Hello, and welcome to This is Cohousing, the Cohousing Podcast. I'm Charles Durrett, author and principal architect at the Cohousing Company. Today, my guest is Alan Ohashi. Alan lives in Silver Sage Cohousing for the last 25 years, one of the earliest senior cohousing built in the U.S. In Boulder, Colorado. I was the original schematic architect. He is also the author of Aging Gratefully in Good Company, Brewing and Happiness, Purpose and Connection, adds life to our years and years to our lives. Alan, welcome.
Thanks, Chuck.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Alan, designing Silver Sage was so much fun. I mean, the entire group was great, but there were three ex-nuns who were very germane because every meeting that we had with the city, they came with me and they were strident and deliberate and thoughtful. Due to them, we got almost everything we wanted. But anyway, Alan, how do you like living there?
I haven't been here since the beginning. I'm a transfer student. If you read through the book, I've had this lifestyle of living collaboratively or cooperatively ever since my large extended family sort of nurtured me and my sister in terms of, how to get along with other people. And that's a thread that's gone all the way through my life, from living in the dorms in college to living in upstairs apartment above the Ace Hardware store. So I was used to walkability and lived when I came to Boulder. I did the sofa serving thing and lived in a Buddhist centered co-op house. My very first purchase was, I call it an intentional zoo with two other guys when I was living in a coal boom town in Wyoming. So when I came to Silver Sage, it was just another iteration of my path living with other people and trying to get along with them. So it's been, a pretty good fit for me.
It must be interesting because there's a lot of characters there. It was the peak of my designing co-housing, frankly. And then I had an excellent guy come by and finish the working drawings. So worked out pretty well. You say in your book that you frequently get the question, why aren't there more co-housing? And you tried to address it as a frequently asked question. I frequently get the question, what if somebody is disagreeable? I mean, I hardly do a presentation, including the last one I did in Denver, Colorado, where first question, hey, Chuck, what if somebody is very hard to get along with? And I always answer, well, it gets worse than that. What if you're the one who's very hard to get along with and you have to train yourself to be more agreeable? But what do you say to that?
Well, I guess I kind of look at it from what's the root cause of all of this. We still have this American way pounded into our heads ever since we've popped out of the womb. Bigger is better than smaller, and richer is better than poor, and winning is better than losing, and all these sort of pull yourselves up by the bootstraps. And generally speaking, when people are disagreeing, it's arguing over some sort of scarce resource or arguing over something that's not going my way, or I'm not in favor of this. And so I think it's deeply rooted in the American psyche to not work together, not collaborate. We've been at this for 600 years, Western expansion, and we got to get better, we got to get bigger, we got to grow more, we got to, be more important than the other person. And so that's just been kind of the alchemy of the American social culture.
Interesting. You're right. I mean, too often culture itself is discounted. American culture is too much me, 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 and we've got to grow towards we, and we've got some way to go with that for sure. Hey, Alan, addressing your previous subtitle, How Co-housing Can Bridge the Cultural Divide, it made me remember that when we first moved into our co-housing, which was 34 units, 55 adults, and 37 kids, we had one woman who was half Hispanic. That was it. That was the entire representation of the minorities. But she had a couple of kids. And when she was organizing the project with me and Katie, we only had 10 kids total. So she got extremely proactive writing letters to parenting magazines and others to extol the advantages of parents raising your child in a more child-friendly environment. Then we had a woman move in who was first generation Chinese American from Taiwan, and then she very proactively got the word out there that said we wanted more people of color living in our co-housing. And then we had 11 minorities, including 7 Asians and 4 African Americans. So I know there's a lot of concern about co-housing being mostly Caucasians in America, but I really want to suggest that co-housing groups, if they really want to enhance diversity, that they reach out. Do you have any theories about that?
I do, I suppose. And you kind of mentioned it, nailed it by saying that there's like 90% chance that you're a white person if you live in co-housing and 75% chance that you're a woman. When you go back to the basic construct, your construct is that, it's a Western European thing. And you observed it in largely Caucasian Western European landscape in Scandinavia. And had you gone to, say, the township of Soweto in South Africa, you might have had a different perspective on intentional community, which also happens to be a way of life there. I had a chance to go to South Africa and hang around with a community that was trying to form. And what was happening there was they were trying to make uh, sort of American or Caucasian brand co-housing in a predominantly African landscape. And so when I went there, what I found was is that the reason that the people in South Africa didn't really buy into Western version of co-housing is because they'd been doing it already on their own. I stayed with a guy who got me a place to stay in a family compound, and there were 4 or 5 little apartments where family members lived, and the main house lived the matriarch and the patriarch, and they were empty nesters, and so they were kind of using their compound as a B&B. And so I went there and had my own room, but there were also younger family members who were living in the compound. And you go into the main house, and that was basically the common house. There was a kitchen and a living area. The family was very welcoming. So, a place like South Africa, collaborative living is something that's been going on for generations and centuries. And so that was my experience there, and I'm sure it was similar to your experience in Denmark. But if it were me coming to start up, figure out this new model of housing, mine would have taken place in South Chicago, and I come in Los Angeles. It would have taken place in places other than white bread locations.
Hmm. Well, I'm still looking forward to other groups of people stopping and being very introspective about who are we as a culture, where do we want to go as a culture, and how do we get
I
there?
think we're going to get kind of forced into that because, the demographers say that by the year 2045, the United States is going to be a majority minority country. And so, what's going to happen if co housing keeps going the way it is going by catering to the 1%? It's going to end up becoming sort of more of a safety net for the dwindling white population. And so the National Co-Housing Alliance has sort of changed their focus a bit to be more open to the other 98% or 99% who like co-housing, but don't have millions of dollars, don't have 5 years of spare time on their hands to build a traditional co-housing community, which is kind of the traditional bread and butter of co-housing communities.
Well, I can't wait for that to happen because personally, as an architect, I prefer to design things with people instead of for people. I don't feel like designing anything for anybody is going to work like co-housing works. I mean, if you talk to your neighbors and how collaborative that was, they had a lot to say when we designed that project. And they had a lot of strident input, which I really appreciated every last line item. They built that project not brick by brick, but decision by decision. So I can't wait for that day to happen where more people are saying, we want this, and end up with their own architects, etc. But it turns out to be a challenge to listen to a culture and reflect exactly who they are and what they want to become. But it's far from impossible. And that's why I had that guest on who's an anthropologist, because before I started co housing in the US, I interviewed 7 Danish anthropologists and 1 American anthropologist about how do we find and reflect best the values, the experiences, the needs, the wants, and the desires of those folks at the table. It was fascinating. And, when I spent a year in Southeast Africa, 6 months in Tanzania and 6 months in Malawi, and my job was moving villages that were in harm's way, mostly in floodwaters. I don't know if you heard recently, but Nairobi just had a flood where 100 people died. Southeast Africa has an amazingly weird weather pattern. It's dry for 6 months and then it pours for 6 months. And boy, when it pours, it really is dangerous. So, anyway, I'm really looking forward to that future where a lot of people are angling towards a community where they feel very much reflects their needs, wants, and desires. Many of our needs and wants and desires are similar, get up in the morning, go to work, raise children, etc. But there's nuances that make us all different. And increasingly, those nuances are coming through. I mean, more and more projects that I'm working on have a bigger contingent of folks who are not Caucasian. And it's fascinating over and over again to meld those interests, needs, and wants and desires. Well, thank you, man. I love the statement in your book that says co housing can evolve from a social movement to a social norm. Say more about that.
But if there's any social configuration that can bridge cultural divides, it's co-housing. But that takes all the work that we've been talking about. How do you unwind the tapes in your head? Remember how you were brought up and how did you end up how you are? Why is it that you think a certain way about people who are different than you? And unpack those thoughts and unpack those processes that helped you become who you are. And then reverse engineer those thoughts so that you can understand people better because you understand yourself better. How do we reinvent the American way to be more about caring and sharing rather than amassing and accumulating? How can we share and collaborate rather than winning and being better than the other person? How do we accept people for who they are rather than by assimilation? And so it's this idea of understanding ourselves better, which also helps us to understand others better and be accountable and be allies.
That's a really good point. Very profound, frankly. One thing that strikes me is how sometimes it seems difficult to cross what appears to be a cultural divide, but when you relate to others in co housing, you simply address them, see them, feel them, just like everybody else. I mean, I really like that point in your book about how co housing can potentially cross the cultural divide, because once you end up in a co housing community and with neighbors who know you, care about you, and support you. I find that living in co-housing, I don't think of anybody as different than me, better, worse, and that I have to listen to them. I want to listen to them, and together we have to come to a consensus. Is that your experience?
Well, I'm the raisin in the Silver Sage oatmeal over here. When I was growing up, it was right after World War II, and we had an internment camp in Wyoming. And so my parents were pretty freaked out. My sister and I were raised to straddle two worlds. We still had our Japanese traditions, but at the same time, we had to be Americans, speak English, go to American schools, live in the suburbs, be as American as you can to sort of fly under the radar. That was the talk that I got growing up. Whatever you do good won't be noticed, but whatever you do bad, people are going to pay attention to that. And not only does it reflect badly on you and our family, it's going to reflect badly on every other Asian because that's just what the experience is. For 600 years in America, basically, a country founded on oppression. And so my experience is because I have been socialized into acting and thinking like a white person, I'm able to straddle that divide. But then all my neighbors haven't had that experience, including yourself. You haven't had that experience. And so for you to say, well, I view everybody as the same, or I don't see color, I hear that a lot. What that does is that discounts my story. That discounts everybody's story by thinking that I look at everybody the same, and so that makes me this guy who is accepting of everybody. Even in my community, there's 30 white people and me, and so it's a matter still of me trying to get to know them, not just as another white guy or gal. I have to get to know them as individuals. But looking at someone who's different than them, that ends up being the challenge because most people don't have that experience at the same time, trying to bridge or sort of abet the oppression at one level.
Yeah, I understand that saying that we're all the same is considered a bit of a microaggression. But what I find is I'm so happy how when no matter who's speaking, if you're new or if you're an older person or a younger person, I love the fact that I sort of zone in and pay attention and feel like I give them as much regard. I hang on their every word just like everybody else I feel does.
Yeah, and I think that's good. Co-housing isn't perfect, but if there is one social configuration that has a chance to become more inclusive and to bridge divides and to get people to think differently on how to accept others, co-housing is the one social structure that has a chance to do that. But it takes a lot of work. It's hard work. People are afraid to make mistakes. People are afraid to screw up.
And they don't want to walk on eggs either. But I feel like for me personally, I have ADHD and I'm likely to blurt out. I'm impulsive, and you can't be impulsive in co-housing. It's hard for ADHD people to live in co-housing because you have to deliberate ad nauseum. The people I know with ADHD in co-housing feel like they have to work very, 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 very hard, but we're up for it because the benefits far outweigh the negatives, and just part of what makes co-housing interesting.
Yeah, and I think the work that you're doing with neurodiverse communities, I think that's a step in the right direction also because of race and ethnicity and gender differences. I think the hidden people are those who are neurodiverse because they blend right in and you don't really know unless you know. That's positive for co-housing.
No, I think that's true too, because everybody knows they have to work at it. I mean, people with ADHD, especially severe ADHD, it is commonly said that you've suffered 20,000 criticisms by the time you were in the sixth grade. So that's a lot of self consciousness.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And you have to work against that your whole rest of your life. In fact, this new book I written called Neuro Inclusive Community Design, it's about the neurodiversity out there that needs to be addressed and a housing situation. I visited this great project in Iceland where there were 45 people with autism and 45 people who didn't have autism. And they accomplished super economical housing and super high quality housing by being organized and being thoughtful. You know, you also mentioned in your book that lower prices has to happen in co-housing, and I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I feel really confident that we are designing the most economical co-housing at this office. I get especially a fair amount of young people who want us to address that more aggressively. But I always say the very same thing. I always say you have to get organized. I mean, if you think somebody's gonna do it for you, forget about it. Just get organized. For example, a young lady came up to my, little town of Nevada City from Sacramento, California. We spent the day looking at sites in Sacramento on Google Earth that were owned by the city of Sacramento. And it turns out there's just 1,000 sites in Sacramento owned by the city. Only about 1 to 200 that would be appropriate for co-housing, but we had bought a site previously from the city. We compelled upon them that we needed it to be more affordable, more affordable, more affordable, very reasonable seller. And they actually lowered the prices. So I think it's starting to get more obvious that it starts with getting organized. Another project in Eugene, Oregon, working with a group of homeless people. Fortunately, Eugene is a mecca for homeless people in this country, more per capita than anywhere else. You know, we had all kinds of problems, and the homeless people were leaving too much messes and stuff, and we bought rakes and got all this stuff organized, but we weren't getting the cooperation we needed from the city. And I started floating verbally that we were gonna have to march to get some cooperation. And I was amazed that people started to pay attention and they started to find housing for people that needed housing. Do you have a good sense of getting people organized to get affordable housing?
I used to work for Habitat for Humanity, and so I got pretty adept at herding affordable housing cats. I also built a 12-unit affordable solar housing subdivision in Wyoming. And so I've always kind of been dabbling in this affordable housing marketplace. But affordability is still an issue because even if an affordable house is a $500,000, there's only a certain niche of people who can afford a $500,000 because you have to have the 30% down. And
Yeah. That's not affordable.
so I even step back a little bit farther to use kind of the Beacon Hill model, where you have people live in their own homes and they have formed a community. In Massachusetts or in North Boston, there's a bunch of people who've joined together. They pay dues. They do things together, common meals together. They have a common house in various buildings around the neighborhood. So you can accidentally form co-housing communities because, in my view, in the book, brewing beer consisting of the various kinds of hops and the various kinds of spices and things that you put into a beer, those are all are what create the community. People can coalesce together without having to necessarily move out of where they're living and sort of create co-housing in place. Or maybe we'll get a co-op house. Like there are several of them in Berkeley.
Yeah, shared houses is definitely a good way to go.
But, the definition is you have to have a bathroom and a kitchen. Well, what if it were rather than a separate dwelling, maybe it's a locked door from the inside? So I think there are ways that we can tweak the definition of traditional co-housing to make it a little bit more affordable and a little bit more practical for people who don't have millions of dollars and who don't have, 5 years on their hands to sit around and wait for housing to happen.
But what I get frustrated by is how little digging goes on. If you look at Berkeley co-housing, started by four single mothers who said to me from the beginning, Chuck, we want our mortgage payments to be the same as our rent. And those four moms started a co-housing that four units started for 130,000 and their mortgage payments were the same as their rents and they've lived there ever since. Emeryville Co-housing, the unit started at 130,000 in the 90s. Stillwater, Oklahoma, the unit started at 150,000, six of them. That project was started by a woman named Marilyn who worked in a church and she needed a house for 150,000. Silver Sage has six units that are affordable, right? In that case, the city imposed themselves, but it's often doable to get the city involved in helping make affordable housing. But it all comes back to getting organized. And some cases, it's about looking. If you Google co-housing for sale, you're right, they all start at 500,000. But if you get on the telephone and call people that live in the variety of 150 co-housing projects in the US, you would find a different set of answers. Forget about the Google machine. However, that said, the residents of co-housing often want top dollar when they sell their unit for whatever reason. Port Townsend co-housing, 28 units, 11 of them sold for 283,000 because that's all they could afford. Now those same units are selling for 6 and 700,000 because they can. One of the things we also need to do is put equity caps on houses so that you can't sell it for much more than 4 or 5%, which is what the Berkeley Co-housing Group did. In other words, the ultimate affordable co-housing is starting your own project. I always argue that if you want an affordable house in the project that I'm designing, you need to be involved from the beginning. You can't just wait around and consume it. You got to be involved. And basically, it's back to we. All of us have to be involved. I always contend the best way to make affordable housing is to have people in your group who don't have any money and have somebody who's really motivated to get the prices down. And I know if you don't have that, you're going to be paying retail versus wholesale. Anyway, for me, it always comes back to being organized.
I think organization is important, but it's also a matter of getting the seeds planted. Because, like I say, how do we get 10 people who like the idea of co-housing, but they can't afford Chuck Durrett? They can't afford to put 10% down on a piece of ground. But they do have 10 people who live in this apartment building who are interested in co-housing. And so, how do we get people to understand that they can possibly cut down on their rents if they help with the snow shoveling around their neighborhood?
Yeah.
Well, the Big Bang Theory kids, They
Yeah.
work together, they play together, and they do things together, and they have an informal co-housing community without having to put sticks in the ground.
Yeah, I argue it takes 2 things to live in co-housing. One is you have to know how to listen, and if you don't know how to listen, then you have to learn how to listen. I see young groups that get together and somebody in the group, too often a lawyer, who does not wanna pay attention to what other people are saying. But you also have to know how to read. So if you can't avoid Chuck Durrett, you need to get this book called Co-Housing Communities, where I at length talk about how to make affordable co-housing, and I've done everything I can through books to try to make it more obvious. But I don't believe in doing something you don't know how to do. And that has been happening in the US. People have been designing co housing who didn't know what they were doing. And they have been the ones who are especially adept at making expensive co housing. If you don't know what you're doing, you're going to be doing things 2 and 3 times and making it more and more expensive. So perhaps the co-housing network team can find those projects that are actually very economical and get them awareness. However, the more demand for them, the more that they'll just go up. So that's why, again, I believe A, start a project yourself, and B, put equity caps on the project you start so that it can be affordable longer down the line. The only ones that are in perpetuity affordable in Silver Sage are the 6 affordable units because the city imposes equity caps. But the other 10 units don't have equity caps, and as far as I can tell, they're just appreciating every year.
Now, the thing is, when you end up with a situation like that, especially when you have vast differences in unit sizes and 6 are governed by the rules and the other ones by market forces, we end up with 10 billionaires here and then 6 thousandaires. And so there just ends up being this diverse income, ideally a good idea, but in practice, it hasn't been as successful as it may have been imagined.
Yeah, we have work to do, no doubt about it. How has co-housing shaped your elderhood? How is it shaping your elderhood?
Well, like I said, I've lived in kind of this collaborative approach all through my life. I've understood co-housing. I knew about the meetings, working together, and shared this and that, just like I have had in other iterations of my life. But it really wasn't until I was on my deathbed in 2013 that I realized what the co-housing thing was about. My life mattered more. And people brought over tuna casseroles. People helped out. People pounded on the door, see if I was doing okay. And then, lo and behold, one of my other neighbors, his life mattered more all of a sudden. And so we had to care for him, take care of his cat. And so sometimes specific people's lives matter more at a given moment. And so I think that's what's been impactful for me going into elderhood is understanding. We go back to the very first question about being disagreeable. You might be disagreeable with people, but then at the end of the day, if that person needs some caregiving, they need a ride someplace, they need something picked up at the grocery store, then the community part, the human nature part takes over and transcends any kind of differences that you might have. And I find that in my case.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And what has living in co-housing taught you about the bigger world, if anything? Because it's kind of hard to make that leap.
I think people have to straddle two worlds. In fact, I do so more than probably the others. But I got to check my baggage and my ego at the door when I come in here. And so my takeaway is that co-housing is trying to emulate these baby boomer neighborhoods. I was growing up in a suburban neighborhood in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Everybody got along, and co-housing comes pretty close to doing that. Maybe it takes a little while to get that nurtured and in a mature state, but I think that is being kind of a good thing, is the goal. And I think that's one of the things that I've taken away is you can live different ways in different places.
Wow, Alan, I want to thank you immensely. I anticipated chatting with you today.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me aboard.
Well, thank you very, very much. And if you're interested in living in a sustainable neighborhood where people know each other, care about each other, and support each other, as always, you can find out more information about everything discussed in the episode's description. Along with the website, you can find books like Neuro-Inclusive Community Design, courses, events, and sign up for our newsletter. A quick thank you to our production staff at the co-housing company, Natachai Kongojorn Kitsuk and Melissa Turnbull. And until next time, I'm Charles Durrett. Thanks for being part of this conversation.